Chapter 9. Pip attends a burial. One evening, a black-edged envelope was delivered to me at Herbert's rooms. The letter inside informed me that Mrs. J. Gargery had died the previous Monday and that the burial would be next Monday at 3 p.m. This news came as a shock to me. It was the first time that someone close to me had died, and I could not imagine life without my sister, even if I had never loved her or even thought about her recently. I arrived at the forge early on Monday afternoon. Joe was sitting in the front row, wrapped in a black cloak. "Dear Joe, how are you?" I asked. "Pip, dear old boy, you knew her when she was a fine woman," and she could say no more. Biddy, in her neat little black dress, was busy serving food. Old friends from the village were talking quietly among themselves, and I noticed the awful Pumblechook trying to catch my eye as he drank brandy and swallowed large pieces of cake. "May I, my dear sir, may I?" he asked, his mouth full, and shook my hand enthusiastically. My sister's dead body was carried slowly out of the house and through the village, followed by all of us. We could see the marshes and the sails of ships on the river. And there, in the churchyard, next to my unknown parents, my poor sister was laid quietly in the earth, while the birds sang and the clouds danced in the sky. Biddy, Joe and I felt better when all the guests had gone, and we had a quiet supper together. I decided to spend the night at the forge, which pleased Joe very much. I was pleased with myself for offering to do so. I waited until I found Biddy alone. Then I said, "I suppose you won't be able to stay here now, will you, Biddy?" "No, Mr. Pip. I'll stay in the village, but I'll still look after Mr. Gargery as much as I can." "How are you going to live, Biddy?" "If you want any money, I'm going to be the village schoolteacher," she said quickly, her cheeks pink. "I can earn my own money." "Tell me, Biddy, how did my sister die?" "She had been worse than usual, when one evening she said very clearly, 'Joe.' And so I ran to the forge to fetch him, and she put her arms round his neck and laid her head on his shoulder, quite happy. Once she said sorry, and once, 'Pip.' She never lifted her head up again, and an hour later she died." Biddy cried, and I cried too. "What happened to Oleg, Biddy?" "He's still in the village. He doesn't work for Miss Havisham anymore. You know, he follows me sometimes." "You must tell me if he bothers you, Biddy. I'll be here more often now. I'm not going to leave poor Joe alone." Biddy said nothing. "Come, Biddy, what do you mean by this silence?" "Are you quite sure, then, that you will come to see him?" "Oh, Biddy," I said sadly, "this really is a bad side of your character. Don't say any more." And that evening I thought how unkind, how unjust Biddy was to me. Next morning I looked in at the forge before leaving and said goodbye to Joe, who was already hard at work. "I shall be back to see you soon, Joe." "Never too soon, sir," said Joe, "and never too often, Pip." As I walked away, I think I knew that I would not go back. Biddy was right. In London, I did some serious thinking. I could see that my character had not improved since I had heard about my expectations. I was spending far too much money. What was worse, I was a bad influence on Herbert, who was also spending too much. I would have offered to pay his bills, but he was too proud to listen to such a suggestion. I had hoped that on my 21st birthday, I would discover more about my future, but Mr. Jaggers explained that he could not give me any more information except that from now on, I would have £500 a year to spend as I liked. I suddenly thought of a way I could help Herbert. When I asked Wemmick if he could advise me on how to help a friend start up in business, his postbox mouth opened wide. "Choose one of the 6 London bridges," he said, "and throw your money over it. That's better than investing money for a friend. That's my official opinion, of course." So you would give me a different opinion at Walworth?" "You'll be welcome there, Mr. Pip, on private business." Next Sunday, I visited Wemmick and his aged parent at the castle. This time there was a lady called Miss Skiffins, clearly a regular visitor, who made the tea and sat next to Wemmick on the sofa. When he and I were alone, Wemmick listened carefully to my request and, after thinking hard, found an answer. With his help, I arranged to invest some money in a shipping company called Clarkers. Finally, I signed an agreement with them in which they promised to offer Herbert a job and later to make him a partner. At last, I felt that my expectations had done some good to someone. While Stella lived in London, staying with friends of Miss Havisham's, I often visited her. She had an endless stream of admirers, and I was jealous of all of them. I never had an hour's happiness with her, but I still thought about her day and night, and my dearest wish was to marry her. Several times Miss Havisham ordered me to bring Stella to visit her, and of course I always obeyed. Stella was as proud and cool as ever, with her admirers, with Miss Havisham, and with me. One man who admired her and followed her everywhere was the unpleasant Bentley Drummle. One day I asked her about him. "Stella, why do you encourage someone like Drummle? You know very well he's stupid and nobody likes him."
"Don't be foolish, Pip,"
she answered.
"Perhaps I encourage him because that has a certain effect on the others."
"But he isn't worth it," I cried angrily.
"What difference does it make?"
she answered tiredly.
"If I smile at him, it's because it means nothing to me. You should be glad that I don't give you false looks and smiles. At least I'm always honest with you."
But while my heart was aching for Stella, I had no idea that I would soon be hit by a disaster which would completely destroy my hopes and dreams. The chain of events which had begun before I ever met her was slowly reaching its end. Herbert and I had moved to rooms in a house by the river in the Temple area. One evening, he was abroad on business and I was alone at home reading. It was terrible weather, stormy and wet, with deep mud in the streets. The wind rushing up the river shook the whole building, and the rain beat violently against the windows. As I closed my book at 11 o'clock, I heard a heavy footstep on the stairs. When I went to the door with my lamp, I saw a man coming slowly upstairs. He was wearing rough clothes, and he was about 60, with a brown face and long gray hair. But what really surprised me was that he was holding out both hands to me. "Can I help you?" I asked politely but coldly. "Ah, yes," he said, dropping his hands.
Yes, I'll explain.
He came into the sitting room, where he looked round admiringly at my furniture and books. He held out his hands to me again, but I refused to take them. Then he sat down heavily on a chair and rubbed his eyes with one rather dirty hand.
You see,
He said,
it's disappointing. Looked forward to this day for so long, I have. But it's not your fault. I'll explain. Is there anybody near who can hear us?
"Why do you, a stranger visiting me late at night, ask that question?" I asked. And then suddenly I knew who he was. In spite of the years that had passed, I was sure he was my convict. And when he held out his hands again, this time I took them. He raised my hands to his lips and kissed them.
You helped me all those years ago, Pip. Never forgotten it.
He seemed to want to put his arms around me, but I stopped him. "If you are grateful to me for what I did in my childhood, I hope you have improved your way of life now. It wasn't necessary to come here to thank me, but you must understand that." I stopped speaking as I noticed how strangely he was staring at me.
What must I understand?
He asked, his eyes fixed on me. "That I don't wish to be your friend. You and I met once in the past, but now our lives are separate. Will you have a drink before you leave?" As I handed him a glass of rum, I noticed that his eyes were full of tears. "I'm sorry if that sounds hard," I added. "I didn't mean it to be. Good luck in the future." We drank together. "How have you been living recently?"
I was sent to Australia, you know, because I escaped from the prison ship. After several years, I finished my punishment, and so I was allowed to work for myself. I did every kind of job there. It was a hard life, but I made a lot of money.
"I'm glad to hear it," I said. "That reminds me, I must give you back the £2 you sent me. I don't need it now." And I handed him 2 new pound notes from my purse. Still watching me, he held them near the lamp until they caught fire.
May I ask,
He said,
how you have done so well since you and I met on those lonely marshes?
His eyes were still fixed on mine, and I began to tremble. "I've been chosen to inherit a fortune," I whispered.
Perhaps I can guess how much,
said the convict.
Could it be, well, £500 a year?
I stood up, holding on to the back of my chair, my heart beating like a hammer.
The agent who arranged it all,
He continued,
was he perhaps a lawyer, name of Jaggers?
Suddenly, I realized the awful truth. I could not speak nor breathe, and fell onto the sofa. He brought his fierce old face close to mine and bent over me.
Yes, Pip, dear boy, I made a gentleman of you. You see, I promised myself that all the money I earned out there in Australia should go to you. I'm your second father, Pip. I'm not a gentleman myself, and I didn't go to school, but I've got you, Pip. And look what a gentleman you are. And what books you've got.
You'll read them to me, Pep, and I'll be proud of you, even if I can't understand them. Didn't you ever think that it could be me who was sending the money?
Oh, no, 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 I replied. Never, never. Wasn't anyone else involved at all?
No, just me and Jaggers, of course. Who else could there be? Dear boy, I kept myself going, you see, through all the hard work, just by thinking of you. And I promised myself I'd come back to England one day and see my boy.
He laid his hand on my shoulder.
Now you must find a bed for me.
He added,
And remember, not a word to anybody. I was sent away for life, and they'll hang me if they discover I've come back.
My feelings were horribly confused. The man who had paid for my educational luxuries for years was risking his life to see me. I could not like him. In fact, my whole body trembled with disgust when he touched me, but I had to protect him. He went to sleep in Herbert's room. After locking all the doors carefully, I sat weakly down by the fire and tried to make sense of my life. How foolish my dreams had been. Miss Havisham had never intended to make me rich or let me marry Estella. But there was something worse than that. It was for this convict, who could be caught or hanged at any moment, that I had deserted Joe. I could never, never, never forgive myself for that.